The Iran-Contra Affair. The Iran-Contra affairs occurred in the 1980s and refer specifically to the foreign policy decisions the Reagan administration made about two countries, Nicaragua and Iran. Iran and Nicaragua were both having a fundamental change to their government as Nicaragua was overthrown by the communist stand-insta government and Iran was at war with Iraq. Reagan was extremely anti-communist and supported the rebel anti-communist Contras. However, a significant portion of the Contras funding up until that time had originated from Nicaragua's cocaine trade, which led Congress to enact the Bolin Amendment. The Bolin Amendments were a series of amendments passed by Congress as a preventative measure against Reagan's antagonistic attempts to interfere with the state of affairs in Nicaragua. Reagan repeatedly asked Congress for funding to help the anti-communist Contra rebels. For 2 years, Congress did. However, Congress knew that if CIA explosives destroyed Soviet ships stationed nearby, it could cause a massive diplomatic crisis if it was revealed that the CIA had been mining Nicaraguan harbors. Later, Congress stopped supporting funding the Contras. Reagan persisted in his efforts to topple the communist government without giving up. In response to this, the first Bolin Amendment was passed. A stricter version of the first Bolin Amendment was ratified in October of 1984. It effectively stopped all U.S. help to the Contras by outright forbidding any military or paramilitary backing for the group. This amendment was a direct reaction to worries that the Reagan administration was giving aid to the Contras through other means, in so evading the first Bolin Amendment. Meanwhile, tensions in the Middle East were escalating. Iraq and Iran were locked in a brutal war while Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed group, held 7 Americans hostage in Lebanon. Determined to secure the release of these hostages, Reagan tasked his advisors with finding a solution. The scandal. In 1985, Reagan's national security advisor, Robert McFarlane, saw an opportunity. Iran had approached the U.S. with a proposal to purchase weapons, despite the existing trade embargo because of the hostage situation. McFarlane argued that selling arms to Iran could not only help bring the hostages home, but also help the U.S. gain a valuable ally in Lebanon. Although Reagan's Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense opposed, Reagan pushed ahead with the deal. The money from the arms deal would be used to secretly fund the Contras in Nicaragua. A plane in Nicaragua that was delivering supplies to Contra fighters was shot down in 1986. Details on Iran's arms sales and Contra support operation were disclosed by the lone survivor and the documents that were discovered. The Iran connection was revealed by a Lebanese magazine, Ashura. Congress and an independent council launched inquiries as a result. How it is linked to the executive branch. Executive decision-making. The key players in the Iran-Contra affair were members of the National Security Council, which is part of the executive branch. These officials, including National Security Advisor John Poindexter and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, made secret decisions to sell arms to Iran and funnel the proceeds to support the Contras in Nicaragua, circumventing congressional restrictions. Presidential involvement. Although President Ronald Reagan initially denied knowledge of the operations, the affair involved his administration's policies. The actions were carried out by his appointees and were authorized in part by people in the executive branch who were tasked with carrying out foreign policy. Use of executive power. The operation was a covert secret initiative that bypassed normal checks and balances, particularly congressional oversight. The executive branch, specifically the National Security Council, took the lead in orchestrating the operation without informing Congress, violating constitutional limits on presidential power. Lack of congressional oversight. One of the central aspects of the affair was that it violated the War Powers Resolution and the Bolin Amendment, both of which were designed to limit presidential powers in military and foreign operations. The executive branch under Reagan acted outside these legal boundaries, creating a huge constitutional conflict. Policies that contributed. The main policy that contributed was the Bolin Amendment. This legislation passed by Congress restricted U.S. government funding for the Contras. The Iran-Contra affair involved circumventing these restrictions. This is the main and most vital policy that contributed to the scandal. Other policies include the U.S. policies towards Iran, the arms embargo. In response to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, the U.S. imposed a comprehensive embargo on Iran. This embargo prohibited the sales of arms and other goods to Iran. Diplomatic relations. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Iran were almost severed, and there was a significant animosity between the two nations. Contra aid. The Reagan administration strongly supported the Contras, a rebel group fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The administration provided significant financial and military aid to the Contras. How it is linked to these policies. Secret arms sales to Iran. Despite the arms embargo, the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran. Diversion of funds. The profits from these arms sales were diverted to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, in direct violation of the Boland Amendment. Hostage diplomacy. The administration hoped that the arms sales to Iran would lead to the release of American hostages held in Lebanon. Benefits. The Boland Amendment allowed for checks and balances, limited presidential power. The amendment served as a check on the president's power, ensuring that Congress had a say in foreign policy decisions. It reinforced congressional oversight. It strengthened the role of Congress in overseeing the executive branch, especially in matters of foreign policy. Reduced U.S. involvement. Prevented escalation. By restricting U.S. support for the Contras, the amendment helped prevent a further escalation of the conflict in Nicaragua. It also avoided a potential difficult situation similar to the Vietnam War, where the U.S. could become deeply entangled in a protracted conflict. It promoted peace and diplomacy. It encouraged diplomatic solutions. The amendment encouraged the U.S. to pursue diplomatic solutions to the conflict in Nicaragua rather than relying on military force. It also supported a more peaceful resolution, as it contributed to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, ultimately leading to democratic elections in Nicaragua. Increased public awareness. The Boland Amendment brought public attention to the U.S. government's involvement in Central America, sparking public debate and scrutiny. Inform public opinion. It helped to inform the public opinion about the potential consequences of U.S. intervention in foreign affairs. Consequences. The most significant consequence was the Iran-Contra affair. In an effort to circumvent the Boland Amendment, the Reagan administration secretly sold arms to Iran and used proceeds to fund the Contras. This led to a major political scandal that tarnished the administration's reputation and damaged U.S. credibility on the international stage. The scandal also raised serious questions about the abuse of executive power and the importance of congressional oversight. It weakened U.S. influence. The restrictions imposed by the Boland Amendment limited U.S. influence in Central America. This allowed other regional powers such as Cuba and the Soviet Union to increase their influence in the region, potentially leading to a more hostile environment for U.S. interests. Limited U.S. policy options. The amendment constrained the U.S. government's ability to respond to evolving circumstances in Nicaragua. It made it difficult for the administration to adjust its policy to new developments, such as changes in the political landscape or increased threats to U.S. interests. This rigidity could have hindered effective diplomacy and limited the U.S. ability to protect its interests. Increased polarization. The Boland Amendment became a highly politicized issue, deepening divisions within Congress and the American public. This polarization made it difficult to find common ground on foreign policy issues and hindered effective diplomacy. It also contributed to a climate of distrust and partisan gridlock, making it harder for the government to address complex challenges. Overall, there were policies that were beneficial, but they were controversial and ultimately illegal. Support for anti-communist forces. One of the main goals was to support anti-communist groups, particularly in Nicaragua, more specifically the Contras, to prevent the spread of communism in Latin America during the Cold War. It strengthened U.S. allies. The U.S. sought to build stronger ties with Iran, especially to gain leverage in the Middle East and combat Soviet influence in the Cold War. It provided funding for the Contras. The sale of arms to Iran was intended to raise money covertly to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, who were fighting the Sandinista government, which the U.S. viewed as communist leading. It gave diplomatic leverage. The arms deal with Iran were partly aimed at improving diplomatic relations, especially with moderate factions within Iran. Avoiding congressional restrictions. The policy circumvented Congress's ban on funding the Contras via the Boland Amendment, allowing continued support for anti-Sandinista forces. Overall consequences. Obviously, it was illegal. These policies involved illegal actions, including the covert sale of arms to Iran, which violated U.S. law, such as the Arms Export Control Act and the Boland Amendment, that prohibited funding for the Contras. This undermined the rule of law and violated constitutional limits on executive power. Betrayal of public trust. The secrecy and deception involved in the Iran-Contra affair led to a serious loss of trust in the U.S. government. The public and Congress were kept in the dark about what was happening, and when the scandal was exposed, it created a massive credibility crisis. Damage to U.S. and Iran relations. The arms deal with Iran, a country that was considered an enemy after the 1979 hostage crisis, undermined U.S. credibility. It sent a mixed message about U.S. policy and contributed to long-term distrust between the two nations. Human rights concerns. The funding of the Contras was controversial because the Contras were accused of committing human rights abuses, including killings, torture, and other atrocities. U.S. support for such a group raised serious ethical concerns. Undermining democracy and congressional oversight. The operation bypassed congressional approval and violated the principle of democratic checks and balances. The executive branch took unilateral actions without consent or knowledge of Congress, undermining the system of government in place to prevent such an overreach. Scandal and legal fallout. The exposure of the Iran-Contra affair led to criminal investigations, convictions, and congressional hearings. Several officers, including Oliver North, were indicted, and the scandal damaged the reputations of those involved, leading to long-lasting political and legal consequences.